There's a silence that exists in old houses, a weight that has little to do with the bricks and mortar and everything to do with the memories soaked into the floorboards. This story was sent to me by a couple, Liam and Chloe, who learned that some memories aren't content to simply be remembered. They are desperate to be replayed, with new actors taking the old, tragic roles. If you've ever thought a historic home was beautiful, this story will show you the price of that beauty. Hit subscribe, because the past is never as quiet as it seems. This account comes from Liam and Chloe. They were young, broke, and deeply in love with the romanticism of the Old South when they landed the gig of a lifetime. Live-in caretakers for the stunningly restored Rosewood Hall Plantation just outside Savannah. The owners, an elderly couple who lived up north, needed someone to maintain the property, give the occasional tour, and keep the ghosts company during the hot, humid off-season. The salary was generous, and the setting was a dream, all white columns and sprawling porches draped in wisteria. The first week was idyllic. They treated the grand, antique-filled house like their own private museum, their footsteps echoing through cavernous, high-ceilinged rooms. The only rule from the owners was specific and odd. A small, white-painted door on the second floor at the end of the hall was to remain locked at all times. No exceptions. The key was not on their ring. "It's just storage for fragile items," the owner had said, over the phone, his voice crackling with distance. Nothing of interest. It was a statement that, in any horror story, is a guarantee of the exact opposite. The first sign was a sound. Chloe was an early riser, and she loved to make coffee in the massive, modernized kitchen as the sun rose. On the third morning, she heard it. A faint, high-pitched, and terribly off-key humming. It was a child's voice, singing a simple, repetitive melody that felt centuries old. It seemed to drift down from the second floor. She shook it off as her imagination, or perhaps the house settling in a way that mimicked a human voice. It was the first rationalization, the first brick in a wall of false calm they would desperately try to build. But here's where it gets really disturbing. A few days later, Liam was dusting the grand staircase banister when he noticed it, a faint, smudgy handprint on the pristine white paint of the locked door. A child's handprint. It was too high for either of them to have made it accidentally. Their curiosity, a slow-burning fuse, was lit. That night, driven by a mix of unease and a determination to prove the house was just a house, they decided to look through the keyhole. Liam knelt, squinting into the darkness. He could just make out shapes in the sliver of moonlight from a window inside the room. Dozens of them. Small, pale, and perfectly still. Dolls. An entire room filled with antique porcelain dolls, all seated or standing, their glassy eyes catching the faint light. The next day, Chloe, a history graduate, dove into the Plantation's records in the library. She found the story of Eliza Mayfield, the 7-year-old daughter of the original owner, who had died from a sudden violent fever in the summer of 1859. The room she died in was the nursery, the very room that was now locked. The record noted that the girl was buried with her favorite doll, a French porcelain figure named Celeste. A chill, deep and permanent, settled in the house for them after that. What happened next will haunt you. The sounds escalated. The humming turned into faint, whispered conversations in a dialect they could barely understand. They'd catch words like master and hush and he's coming. One afternoon they returned from town to find the entire first floor of the house rearranged. Chairs were pulled out from tables, books were laid spine up on the floor, and a trail of dried, crumbling rose petals led from the front door to the foot of the stairs. It was a child's idea of a party, frozen in a moment of time. They were no longer just caretakers. They were participants in a game whose rules they didn't know. The truth was far worse than they imagined.
Driven by a terror that had eclipsed their curiosity, they finally pried the lock on the white door with a crowbar. The smell that wafted out was of dust, old perfume, and something sweetly rotten. The doll room was even more horrifying than the keyhole had suggested. Dozens of dolls, in various states of dress and disrepair, were arranged in a perfect circle. And in the center of the circle sat Celeste, the doll from the grave, her porcelain face pristine, her dress faded but clean. As they watched, frozen in the doorway, the head of every doll in the circle creaked slowly, mechanically, to face them. A single, unified whisper, like the rustling of dead leaves, filled the room. "He is here." They weren't being haunted by a little girl. They were being protected by one. Eliza's spirit, trapped in the place of her death, was using her dolls as a sentinel network. The master she whispered about wasn't her father from 1859. It was the residual, cruel energy of the plantation itself. The anger, the oppression, the violence that had taken on a life of its own. It was a predatory presence that patrolled the house, and it viewed Liam and Chloe as new, fresh subjects for its malevolence. The childish rearranging of furniture, the whispered warnings, were Eliza's attempts to scare them away before this other, darker entity could truly notice them. By forcing their way into her sanctuary, they had just announced their presence, loud and clear. They didn't pack. They ran, leaving every possession behind. They called the owners from a motel 50 miles away, stammering a resignation. The owners were silent for a long moment before the old man sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "We were hoping it would be different for you," he said softly, and then the line went dead. Liam and Chloe moved to a new city, into a modern apartment with no history. But Chloe can't walk past a toy store without her heart racing. And Liam sometimes wakes in the dead of night, convinced he can hear the faint, off-key humming of a child's lullaby, a sound that smells of dust and wisteria, a final, desperate warning from a little girl who is still trying to save them from the master of the house.
There is a weight to history that goes beyond books and monuments. It's a pressure in the soil, a whisper on the wind, a debt that compounds with interest across generations. This account comes from Dr. Marcus Jones, a historian who went looking for names in a ledger and found that some accounts are never closed. They're just waiting for the right heir to come and settle them. If you've ever looked into your own family's past, this story will make you wonder what might be looking back. Subscribe, because the past keeps its own books, and your name might already be on a page. This account comes from Marcus. He was a man who lived in the crisp, orderly world of archives and academic journals. His life's work was reconstructing the fractured family trees of Black Americans, piecing together lineages shattered by slavery and obscured by the brutal economics that followed. His latest project brought him to the ruins of the Oak Grove Plantation in rural Georgia. The land was now owned by a timber company, but they'd granted him a week for a preliminary archaeological survey of the former slave quarters, a rare and precious opportunity. The Georgia heat was a physical presence, thick and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The quarters were little more than faint depressions in the soil and a few scattered, tumble-down bricks being slowly consumed by kudzu. It was slow, meticulous work, sifting through the dirt, finding nothing but shards of pottery and rusted nails. On its third day, as frustration began to set in, his trowel hit something that wasn't rock or root. It was a metallic clink. He carefully excavated a rusted, hinged metal box, its lock long since fused shut by corrosion. With a painstaking delicacy, he pried it open. Inside, protected from the worst of the elements, was a ledger. It wasn't a plantation record from the slavery era, but something arguably more insidious, a sharecropper's ledger from 1872 to 1875. The handwriting was a tight, angry scrawl detailing transactions with freed families, the Johnsons, the Washingtons, the Freemans. It listed acres worked, bales of cotton picked, and the furnish provided by the landowner, seed, tools, molasses, cloth. And beside each entry, in a column that made Marcus's stomach turn, was the ever-mounting balance due. No matter how much cotton was picked, the debt always grew. It was a ledger of hope systematically crushed into peonage. He took the ledger back to his rented room in a nearby motel, his historian's excitement warring with a deep personal sorrow. Many of the surnames in the ledger, Johnson, Washington, were common in the nearby town. That evening, he began the solemn task of transcribing the entries for his records, speaking the names aloud to honor them. Elias Johnson, 40 acres, 12 bales. Balance due, $82.16. As the names left his lips, the small, stuffy room grew cold. A profound silence fell outside, the crickets and frogs suddenly ceasing their chorus. He felt it then, for the first time, a sensation of being watched from the darkness beyond his window, a pressure of silent, collective attention. The next morning, he drove into the small town of Pineview to visit the county clerk's office. He wanted to cross-reference the names. The elderly white clerk, a man named Mr. Dawes, became visibly uncomfortable when Marcus showed him the ledger. "That's old business," Dawes said, his voice tight. "Best to let some things lie, son." But as Marcus compared the ledger to modern tax rolls, his blood ran cold. The family lines were direct. The Johnsons from the ledger were the great-grandparents of the Johnsons who now owned a small auto shop on Main Street. The Washingtons were now teachers and nurses. The debts of the past were genetically tied to the present of this town. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Returning to his motel that night, Marcus opened the ledger to continue his work. The page he had transcribed the night before was different. The numbers in the balance due column had changed. Elias Johnson's debt was no longer $82. It was now listed as $1,142.67, a number that felt bizarrely, terrifyingly precise. He blinked, thinking it a trick of the light. He checked his own notes. His transcription was correct. The ledger itself was updating, translating the historical debt into a modern, crushing figure. This was no longer a relic. It was a living, breathing, and vengeful document. The false calm of academic attachment shattered completely. What happened over the next 2 days will haunt you. The presence that had been watching from the woods was now in the room with him. He began to see them at the edge of his vision, tall, gaunt figures in faded, ragged work clothes. They stood silently among the pine trees, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats, their postures radiating a weary, ancient despair. They didn't move or speak, only watched. They were the men from the ledger, the ones whose labor had built this town and whose futures had been stolen by its arithmetic. The truth was far worse than he imagined. It wasn't just the ledger. It was the land itself. Oak Grove was a place of unresolved supernatural injustice. The system of debt peonage had been so inherently evil, so contrary to the natural order, that it had created a metaphysical wound. The ledger was the focal point of that wound, a cursed object that bound the descendants of both the oppressed and the oppressor to this cycle. The spirits weren't angry at him. They saw him, a descendant of their struggle, as a conduit. They couldn't rest until the debt was acknowledged, until the ledger was settled not with money, but with truth, with recognition, with a breaking of the silence that had protected this injustice for 150 years. The climax came on his final night. He sat at the small desk with the ledger open before him, the spectral sharecroppers now visible at the tree line, watching, waiting.
The numbers on the page swirled and shifted, the debts of a dozen families spiraling into impossible generational sums. He understood then what he had to do. It wasn't about documenting history anymore. It was about closing the case. He took a pen, not to transcribe, but to write. On a fresh page, in bold, clear letters, he wrote, "This debt is paid in full. The account is closed. You are free." The moment the last period was dotted, the air left the room in a great whoosh. The pages of the ledger began to flutter violently, as if in a hurricane, and then fell still. The rust, which had been static for a century and a half, spread across the entire book in seconds, crumbling it into a pile of reddish dust. Outside, one by one, the spectral figures at the tree line, slowly, deliberately, removed their hats. For a fleeting second, he saw their faces, not angry, but relieved, with a profound, weary gratitude. And then they were gone. The crickets resumed their singing. Marcus left Pineview the next morning. He never published a paper on Oak Grove. Some truths are too fragile, too powerful for academic journals. But he still does his work, tracing family histories. He's just more careful now about which threads he pulls. Because he knows that history isn't just something we read about. It's something that is, in some dark and quiet places, still waiting to be balanced. And sometimes, the ledger keeper isn't a person, but the very memory of the injustice itself, and it will use any willing hand it can find to finally close the books.
We build structures to give ourselves a sense of security, of order. But what happens when the very architecture of a place is designed to channel something else? This account comes from an architect named Eva, who was hired to assess a house and ended up evaluating the stability of a nightmare. If you've ever sought a room with a view, this story will convince you to keep the curtains drawn. Subscribe, because some things are better left unseen. This account comes from Eva. She specialized in historical preservation, a calling that blended her love of beautiful old things with her pragmatic understanding of load-bearing walls and foundation settling. The offer to survey Magnolia Bluff, a pre-Civil War plantation house teetering on a river bluff in rural Georgia, was a career highlight. The place was infamous, a stunning Greek Revival mansion that had been abandoned for decades, its isolation and the tragic story of its last resident keeping even the most daring vandals at bay. The client was a distant, faceless investment group considering a restoration, and they needed a full structural report. From the moment her car bumped down the overgrown, mile-long driveway, the feeling of being observed was palpable. The house was a magnificent ruin, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin, but its columns still standing proud against the oppressive southern sky. And at the very top, the Widow's Walk, a railed platform atop the roof, seemed to beckon. It was the reason for the house's name, a place where the women of the house would have watched for their seafaring husbands to return up the river. Her initial survey of the ground floor was standard: water damage, rot, the usual sins of time and neglect. But the higher she went, the more the atmosphere thickened. The air grew cold and carried a faint, briny scent, completely alien to the Georgia pine forests surrounding the property. It was on the Widow's Walk itself that she found the first true anomaly. The floorboards weren't just worn, they were studded with hundreds of hand-forged, rusted iron nails, driven deep into the wood in intricate, spiraling patterns that made her engineer's mind ache. They weren't structural, they were deliberate, ritualistic. Back inside, her technology began to betray her. Her laser level, when placed on a visibly slanted floor in the master bedroom, showed a perfect, unwavering line. Her digital camera glitched, producing photos filled with swirling static in the upper corners of the rooms, always near the ceilings. Her rational mind, her fortress of false calm, began to build its defenses.
Old houses have strange magnetic fields. Humidity plays havoc with electronics. The nails were some form of forgotten folk art. She was a woman of science, and science demanded evidence. But here's where it gets really disturbing. In a dusty hidden compartment of a writing desk in the study, she found a journal. Its pages were brittle and foxed, the script an elegant feminine hand. It belonged to Cordelia, the wife of the plantation's final owner, a sea captain named Alistair. The entries began with hope, describing how she had the widow's walk built to watch for his merchant ship to return up the river. But as the months turned into years with no word, the writing deteriorated into frantic, desperate scrawls. She wrote of consulting root women from the quarters, of learning old charms to call a lost love home. The nails in the walk were part of a powerful binding spell, a web to pull him from the deep, as she put it. The final entry was a single, ink-blotted sentence. "I have poured all of my longing into this house, and now the house is hungry. Something is climbing the bluff." The truth was far worse than she imagined. Cordelia's magic hadn't just failed, it had been catastrophically successful. It hadn't pulled Alistair back, but it had torn a hole, a metaphysical wound that attracted something else from the same dark, watery depths where her husband had perished. The entity that now inhabited Magnolia Bluff wasn't a ghost. It was a parasite, a thing of profound hunger that had been lured by the scent of a widow's bottomless grief. The nails weren't a spell anymore. They were a crumbling cage, and Eva's presence, her measurements and her probing, was disturbing the delicate balance that held the thing at bay. The climax came on her final evening. A thick river fog had rolled in, swallowing the house whole. The smell of salt water and rot was now overwhelming, a physical presence in the air. Needing one final measurement from the widow's walk, she forced herself to climb the creaking attic stairs. As she stepped out into the swirling mist, she saw it. The nails in the floor were glowing with a faint, sickly orange light, and the intricate patterns were now visibly pulsing like a dying heartbeat. From the river below, through the fog, she heard a deep, wet, dragging sound, like a massive weight being pulled up the muddy bluff. She looked over the railing, her heart frozen in her chest. The fog parted for a moment, and she saw a shape. A hulking, amorphous form of slick, dark matter and tangled riverweed pulling itself onto the lawn, leaving a glistening trail. It had no face, only one gaping mouth that opened and let out a guttural hiss that was the sound of drowning. It was drawn to the house, drawn to the energy Cordelia had left behind, drawn to her. Eva didn't even pack her tools. She fled down the narrow stairs, through the dark house, and out into the fog, not stopping until she found her car. She drove through the night, the scent of the river clinging to her clothes for days. Her report to the investment group was a masterpiece of professional omission. Structurally unsound, foundations compromised beyond repair, recommend demolition. She later heard they sold the land to a conservation trust and the house was left to the elements. But Eva knows it doesn't matter. The house wasn't the anchor, the wound in the land was. Sometimes on foggy nights near her own home, far from any river, she'll catch a whiff of that same briny decay, and she'll look up, half expecting to see the silhouette of a railed platform against the moonlit clouds, a beacon that after all these years is still calling something home.